Black kid in worn-out shoes went to bank to check account. Manager laughed until he saw the balance. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The glass doors of the bank slid open with a quiet mechanical sigh as a small figure stepped inside from the bright afternoon sun. The marble floor reflected the light like still water, and the air smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive cologne. People in pressed suits stood in line holding folders and envelopes, their voices low and professional. Then the boy walked in, and the quiet rhythm of the room shifted almost immediately. He looked about 12 years old, maybe a little younger, with dark skin and careful eyes that studied everything around him. His hoodie was faded from many washes and hung slightly loose on his shoulders. His jeans were clean, but worn at the knees. The most noticeable thing about him was his shoes. The sneakers had once been white, but were now gray and tired, the soles thin and the laces tied together where they had once broken. One shoe bent slightly at the front with every step as if it had already walked more miles than it should have. The boy paused just inside the doorway, taking a slow breath as if gathering courage. In his hand, he held a small folded paper and a worn bank book with soft edges that had clearly been opened many times. He walked toward the long service counter where several employees worked behind polished glass screens. At the far end of the counter stood the bank manager, Richard Collins, a tall man in a dark tailored suit with silver hair neatly combed and a watch that caught the light every time he moved his wrist. Richard Collins had spent more than 20 years in banking and had developed the habit of judging people within seconds of seeing them. When he noticed the boy walking toward the counter, his eyes narrowed slightly, not with anger, but with the quiet certainty of someone who believed he already understood the situation. A few customers nearby glanced over as well. One woman raised her eyebrows and leaned closer to the man beside her, as if whispering a question. The boy reached the counter and placed the small bank book carefully on the smooth surface. His fingers lingered on it for a moment, pressing it flat as though it carried something important. His voice was calm, but soft when he finally spoke. "Sir, could you please check how much money is in my account?" The manager looked down at the boy, then at the worn shoes, then back at the small bank book on the counter. For a moment, he did not say anything at all. Then a faint smile crept across his face, the kind of smile that appeared when a grown man believed he was about to correct a child who had wandered somewhere he did not belong. A quiet chuckle escaped him as he reached for the book. Around them the room grew slightly quieter, the way a place sometimes does when people sense that something unusual is about to happen. Richard Collins picked up the worn bank book with 2 fingers, as if it might leave dust on his polished counter. The faint smile still rested on his face, and the customers nearby watched with the quiet curiosity that appears whenever someone believes a small scene of embarrassment is about to unfold. The manager flipped the cover open slowly, glancing down at the faded name printed on the inside page. Ethan Carter. The letters were slightly worn from time. Richard Collins leaned back a little and let out a small, amused breath. "Son, this is a large financial institution. Most people who open accounts here do so with a guardian present." His voice was not loud, but it carried easily across the marble room. A few people waiting in line shifted their weight and looked over again. The boy stood quietly on the other side of the counter. His hands rested on the edge of the surface, small fingers gripping the polished wood just enough to keep them steady. He did not look embarrassed. He did not look angry. He only looked patient. "I have an account here, sir," Ethan said softly. "My father opened it for me." The manager tilted his head slightly as if the answer had confirmed something he already believed. "I'm sure he did," Richard Collins replied. "But accounts are not toys for children to check whenever they feel curious." One of the tellers 2 windows down glanced over with a faint grin that she quickly tried to hide behind her computer screen. Another customer, a middle-aged man in a dark blue suit, folded his arms and leaned slightly to watch what would happen next. Ethan did not move away. Instead, he carefully slid the small folded paper across the counter next to the bank book. My father told me to bring this number if I ever needed to check the account, he said. Richard Collins looked down at the paper. It was a simple slip with a long line of numbers written in careful handwriting. The manager raised one eyebrow. For a moment, he considered handing the paper back and ending the conversation. But the quiet attention of the room had already settled around them like a thin layer of pressure. With a soft sigh, he turned toward the computer terminal behind the counter. Fine, he said calmly. Let us see what we have here. His fingers moved across the keyboard with the quick confidence of someone who had entered thousands of account numbers during his career. The soft tapping sound echoed faintly in the quiet bank lobby. Ethan stood still, watching the screen with calm focus. The computer processed the request. A small loading symbol spun for a brief moment. Richard Collins leaned back in his chair slightly, already preparing the polite explanation he expected to give. He imagined telling the boy that the account was either inactive or held a small balance that required a parent present to access. But then the system responded. The manager frowned slightly as the account profile opened. The information appeared on the screen in neat rows of data. Account name, Ethan Carter. Account type, custodial trust account. Richard Collins blinked once. That was unusual. Custodial trust accounts were rarely opened for children without significant planning. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. He clicked once more to view the full balance. The number had not appeared yet. The system required a confirmation before revealing it. For a brief second he hesitated, then pressed the key. The loading symbol returned to the center of the screen. Around him the bank lobby remained quiet. Ethan Carter waited without speaking, his worn shoes planted firmly against the marble floor. And Richard Collins stared at the screen as the system prepared to reveal the balance. Richard Collins leaned slightly closer to the monitor as the loading symbol continued to spin. The quiet hum of computers and the distant counting machine were the only sounds inside the bank. For a moment, he wondered if the system had frozen, but then the screen refreshed and the account details expanded. The balance field appeared. Richard Collins looked at it quickly, already expecting to see a modest amount that would confirm his earlier assumption. Instead, his eyes paused. The faint smile that had been resting on his face slowly faded. He leaned closer to the screen, squinting slightly as if the numbers might change if he looked again. The balance was written in clear, bold digits across the center of the display. $3,482,910.44. Richard Collins blinked once. His hand remained frozen above the keyboard. For a brief second, he believed the system must have made a mistake. He cleared his throat quietly and refreshed the account page again. The numbers appeared once more without changing. $3,482,910.44. Behind him, one of the tellers noticed the unusual silence and glanced over. The manager rarely hesitated when checking a balance. Ethan Carter stood calmly on the other side of the counter, his eyes following the manager's reaction without showing excitement or fear. To him, the numbers meant something important, but they were not a surprise. Richard Collins slowly sat back in his chair. The leather creaked softly beneath him. His mind began racing through possibilities. Perhaps the account belonged to a wealthy family that had arranged a trust for the boy. Perhaps the system had displayed the wrong profile. He opened the account information again and scanned every line carefully. Account holder name, Ethan Carter. Account type, custodial trust account. Authorized guardian Marcus Carter. The name lingered in his thoughts for a moment. He felt as though he had heard it before somewhere, but he could not immediately remember where. Richard Collins cleared his throat again and looked up at the boy standing quietly at the counter. The room behind Ethan had grown noticeably quieter. Several customers were now openly watching the exchange. The manager spoke more carefully this time. Ethan, correct. The boy nodded once. Yes, sir. The manager rested both hands on the desk as he considered his next words. Your account shows a very significant balance. The boy did not react with excitement. Instead, he simply asked a quiet question. So it is still there. Richard Collins felt a strange pause settle in the air. Yes, he said slowly. is still there. Ethan released a small breath he did not realize he had been holding. My father said I should check it today, he explained. He told me that if anything ever happened to him, I should come here and make sure the account was safe. The manager felt a faint tension tighten in his chest. Anything happened to him? What do you mean by that, son? Ethan lowered his eyes briefly to the bank book resting on the counter. My father passed away last month. The words were spoken simply without anger or tears, but they carried a quiet weight that made the room feel heavier. Richard Collins stared at the boy for a moment. The earlier amusement in his expression had completely vanished. He looked back at the computer screen and at the name again. Marcus Carter. Something about the name stirred a distant memory in the back of his mind, but it remained just out of reach. Around them, the bank lobby had fallen almost completely silent. Even the counting machine had stopped. And Richard Collins continued staring at the balance on the screen, slowly realizing that the boy in worn-out shoes standing in front of him was not who he had assumed at all. Richard Collins felt the quiet weight of the boy's words settle over the counter like a sudden drop in temperature. My father passed away last month. The sentence repeated in the manager's mind while the glowing numbers on the screen continued to stare back at him. $3,482,910.44. For the first time since the boy had walked into the bank, Richard Collins no longer saw worn shoes or a faded hoodie. He saw a child standing alone at a marble counter trying to follow the last instructions his father had given him. The manager slowly closed the balance window and opened the account profile again, this time reading every detail carefully. Account holder Ethan Carter. Custodial trust account established 12 years ago. Authorized guardian Marcus Carter. Richard Collins leaned forward slightly as he read the additional notes attached to the account. Trust instructions prepared by Carter and Wells Legal Group. Restricted withdrawal conditions. Annual verification required upon guardian death. The manager stopped reading for a moment and looked back at Ethan. His voice was quieter now. Your father opened this account when you were very young. Ethan nodded slowly. He said it was for my future. The boy's hands rested calmly on the counter, but his fingers were still wrapped around the edge of the worn bank book as though it connected him to something important. Richard Collins swallowed lightly. Do you have someone with you today? A family member or guardian? Ethan shook his head. No, sir. My aunt works during the day. She told me I could come here after school. I know the bus route. The honesty in the boy's voice carried no trace of fear. It was simply a statement of fact. The manager felt something uncomfortable stir in his chest. Only a few minutes earlier, he had nearly dismissed the boy entirely. Now he realized the child had walked into the bank alone to confirm the one thing his father had told him to protect. Richard Collins turned his attention back to the screen. He clicked through the account records again, searching for the original deposit history. The earliest entry appeared 12 years ago. Initial trust deposit, $500,000. The manager raised his eyebrows slightly. That alone was a significant amount to place in a trust account for a newborn child. But the records continued. Investment reinvestment cycles. Long-term municipal bonds. Index fund growth. Carefully managed deposits made over many years. The account had grown steadily, almost quietly, like a tree planted long ago and left to mature. Richard Collins sat back again, thinking about the name Marcus Carter. The more he saw it on the screen, the more it stirred a memory he could not quite grasp. Ethan broke the silence with another small question. My father said the money would help me go to college one day. Is that still true? The manager looked at the boy again, this time with a completely different expression. Yes, Ethan, he said, gently. If the account remains protected, it will do much more than that. Ethan nodded slowly, as if confirming something important inside his mind. Good. My father wanted that. The boy glanced briefly around the bank lobby. The customers who had once watched with curiosity now looked at him differently. Some with surprise, some with quiet respect. Richard Collins felt a faint tension building in the back of his mind. Marcus Carter. The name kept echoing somewhere deep in his memory, like a distant sound he had heard before but could not yet identify. He turned back to the account profile one more time and opened the archived records connected to the trust. A new document appeared on the screen. The title read, Trust Origin Statement Submitted by Marcus Carter. Richard Collins hesitated for a moment before opening the file, unaware that the words inside were about to change the way he looked at the boy standing quietly in front of him. Richard Collins stared at the document title for a moment before opening it. The quiet glow of the monitor reflected in his glasses, while the bank lobby remained unusually silent behind him. The file expanded across the screen, and a block of text written many years earlier slowly appeared. Trust Origin Statement submitted by Marcus Carter. Richard Collins began reading. The statement was not written in complicated legal language. It was simple and direct, almost personal, as if the man who wrote it wanted someone to understand the reason behind every dollar placed into the account. The document explained that the trust had been created to secure the future education and living stability of Ethan Carter. Richard Collins continued reading carefully. Each year, additional funds were deposited into the account through a combination of salary savings, investment growth, and settlement payments connected to a workplace incident many years earlier. The manager paused slightly at that line. Workplace incident. He continued reading. The statement described Marcus Carter as a firefighter who had served in the city fire department for more than a decade. Richard Collins felt something shift inside his memory as he read those words. The name Marcus Carter began to echo more clearly in his thoughts. Firefighter. The manager leaned closer to the screen and read the next paragraph slowly. The trust account was created after a rescue incident in which Marcus Carter suffered severe injuries while evacuating civilians from a structural fire in a commercial office building. Richard Collins felt a faint tightening in his chest. His mind began searching through old memories like someone opening a long closed drawer. The document continued explaining that Marcus Carter had received a compensation settlement after the incident and had chosen to place a large portion of that money into a protected trust for his son. Richard Collins stopped reading and slowly looked up at Ethan standing quietly across the counter. The boy had not moved. He was watching the manager patiently, waiting for confirmation that the account his father had trusted was still safe. Richard Collins turned back to the screen and scrolled further down the document. The next paragraph contained a short handwritten note that had been scanned into the system. The handwriting was careful but slightly uneven, as if written by someone whose hands had once been injured. The note read that every dollar placed into the account represented the hope that Ethan Carter would have opportunities his father never had. Richard Collins felt the quiet weight of those words settle into the room. Around them, the customers continued pretending not to watch, but their attention remained fixed on the counter. Ethan shifted his weight slightly on his worn shoes. He looked up at the manager again and spoke in the same calm voice he had used from the beginning. My father always said the money was not the important part. Richard Collins blinked and looked back at him. What did he mean by that? Ethan answered simply. He said the important part was that I would have choices. The manager sat quietly for a moment, absorbing the boy's words. Then he looked down again at the final section of the trust document. At the bottom of the file was a short record describing the original rescue incident connected to the settlement. The location listed on the report was an office tower downtown. Richard Collins felt a sudden chill run through him as he recognized the address. His hands slowly moved away from the keyboard. The memory that had been hiding in the back of his mind finally stepped forward with startling clarity. 10 years earlier, a major fire had broken out in that same office building. Richard Collins had been working late that night in his office on the upper floor. The fire had spread quickly through the electrical systems, and smoke had filled the stairwells. For several terrifying minutes, he had believed he would not make it out of the building alive. Then a firefighter had reached him through the smoke and guided him down the emergency stairs. Richard Collins felt his breath slow as the memory unfolded. The firefighter who had pulled him out of the burning building had carried the name Marcus Carter on the back of his jacket. Richard Collins felt the memory settle over him like smoke returning to a room that had once burned. The office tower, the fire, the choking darkness in the stairwell. He could see it again with uncomfortable clarity. The alarm screaming, the emergency lights flickering red across the walls, people coughing and shouting as thick gray smoke filled the hallway. 10 years earlier, he had been trapped on the upper floor of that building when the fire spread through the electrical system. The elevators had shut down, and the stairwell had filled with smoke. Richard Collins remembered the moment he had leaned against the wall, his chest tight and his breathing shallow, convinced that he would not make it out. Then a firefighter had appeared through the haze like a shadow, moving through firelight. The man had shouted instructions, his voice calm but urgent. He had wrapped a strong arm around Richard Collins and guided him step by step down the emergency stairs. The memory returned with vivid detail. The firefighter had carried extra weight on one shoulder because another injured man was leaning against him. Even while supporting two people at once, he had kept moving forward through the smoke. Richard Collins remembered seeing the name stitched across the back of the firefighter's coat as they reached the ground floor exit. Carter. The memory struck him with sudden force. Richard Collins blinked and looked at Ethan standing across the counter. The boy had the same steady eyes, the same quiet patience. The manager felt a strange tightness in his throat as the connection became undeniable. Marcus Carter had not only saved civilians that night, he had saved Richard Collins himself. For a moment, the manager simply stared at the boy without speaking. The lobby behind them remained quiet, but the tension in the air had changed. The earlier amusement that had filled the room had disappeared completely. Richard Collins slowly pushed his chair back on the desk and stood up. The movement caught the attention of the tellers nearby. The manager rarely stood during a routine account inquiry. Ethan watched him with calm curiosity. The boy had no idea what realization had just taken place. Richard Collins walked around the counter until he was standing on the same side as Ethan. The marble floor felt colder beneath his shoes than it had only minutes earlier. He stopped a few feet in front of the boy and looked down at the worn sneakers that had first caught his attention when Ethan entered the bank. The thin soles, the laces tied together where they had once broken. Richard Collins felt a wave of quiet shame pass through him. Only a short time ago, he had nearly dismissed this child without even checking the account properly. The boy who had walked into the bank with worn shoes carried the future his father had sacrificed so much to protect. Ethan looked up at him and spoke again with the same calm tone. "Sir, is something wrong?" Richard Collins shook his head slowly. "No, Ethan, nothing is wrong. In fact, everything is exactly as your father intended." The manager hesitated for a moment before continuing. "Your father was a very brave man." Ethan lowered his eyes briefly as if the words carried a familiar weight. He always said his job was just helping people. Richard Collins felt another quiet shift inside his chest. Helping people. The phrase echoed against the memory of the burning stairwell and the firefighter who had refused to leave anyone behind. The manager turned slightly and gestured toward the office behind the counter. "Ethan, would you mind stepping into my office for a few minutes? I would like to explain a few things about your account and make sure everything your father planned continues to protect you." Ethan nodded politely. "Yes, sir." As they began walking toward the office door, several customers in the lobby watched silently. The same boy who had entered the bank only minutes earlier had been treated like a small inconvenience. Now the manager of the entire branch was personally escorting him inside with a level of respect that had not existed before. And Richard Collins knew that the truth about Marcus Carter was only beginning to change the way everyone in that room saw the quiet boy with worn out shoes. Richard Collins opened the glass door to his office and stepped aside so Ethan could walk in first. The room was quieter than the busy lobby outside. Large windows allowed warm afternoon sunlight to stretch across the wooden desk and the shelves lined with neatly arranged financial binders. Ethan stepped carefully onto the soft carpet, glancing around with quiet curiosity. The office looked very different from the noisy bank floor. It felt calm, almost private, like a place where important decisions were made slowly and thoughtfully. Richard Collins closed the door behind them and motioned toward a chair across from his desk. Ethan sat down politely, placing the worn bank book in his lap as if it were something fragile. Richard Collins remained standing for a moment, looking at the boy in front of him. The image of the burning stairwell from 10 years earlier still lingered in his mind. He could almost hear the firefighter's voice again, steady and determined through the smoke. Stay close to me. We will get out together. Richard Collins finally sat down behind his desk. His voice was calmer now, carrying none of the impatience he had shown earlier at the counter. Ethan, I would like to tell you something about your father. Ethan lifted his eyes immediately. My father. Richard Collins nodded slowly. Yes. Many years ago, there was a fire in a large office building downtown. I worked in that building at the time. The manager paused briefly, remembering the choking smoke and the confusion of that night. I was trapped on one of the upper floors when the fire spread through the stairwells. For a few minutes, I believed I might not survive. Ethan listened quietly, his small hands folded around the edges of the bank book. Then a firefighter came through the smoke and helped guide several of us out of the building. He carried an injured man on one side and supported me with his other arm while we walked down the stairs. Richard Collins leaned slightly forward. That firefighter was your father. Ethan blinked slowly, as if the words had arrived gently rather than suddenly. My father helped you. Richard Collins nodded. He saved my life that night. The boy looked down for a moment, absorbing the information quietly. My father did not talk much about the fires, Ethan said softly. He only said that helping people was part of the job. Richard Collins felt a faint smile touch his face. That sounds exactly like something he would say. The manager opened a drawer in his desk and removed a folder containing printed records of the trust account. He placed it carefully on the desk between them. Ethan, your father worked very hard to build this account for you. Every deposit, every investment, every plan was created so that you would have a safe future. Ethan nodded slowly. He told me that the money was not just for school. He said it was so I could make choices in life. Richard Collins leaned back slightly in his chair, studying the boy with quiet respect. Your father was right. This account is more than money. It is a promise he built for you over many years. The sunlight shifted slightly across the desk as the afternoon moved forward. Outside the office door, the soft murmur of the bank lobby could still be heard. Richard Collins closed the folder gently and spoke again. Ethan, I want to make sure that promise remains protected exactly the way your father intended. Ethan looked up again. Thank you, sir. The manager nodded once, feeling a deeper sense of responsibility than he had expected when the boy first walked through the bank doors. What neither of them realized yet was that the story of Marcus Carter and the trust he created would soon spread beyond the quiet office and begin changing the way everyone in that bank looked at the boy with worn-out shoes. Richard Collins remained seated for a moment after closing the folder, watching Ethan quietly across the desk. The boy sat calmly in the chair, his worn sneakers resting flat against the soft office carpet while his hands continued holding the old bank book. The sunlight from the window touched the edge of the desk and reflected gently across the polished wood. Outside the office door, the quiet sound of the bank lobby continued, a low rhythm of footsteps, counting machines, and distant voices. Richard Collins finally stood and walked toward the door. When he opened it, the lobby looked slightly different than it had earlier. Several employees glanced up immediately. They had noticed that the branch manager had personally escorted the boy into his office, and curiosity had slowly spread across the room. Richard Collins stepped aside and motioned for Ethan to follow him back to the counter. The boy stood and walked beside him without hesitation. When they returned to the service counter, the same tellers who had earlier hidden their smiles were now watching with careful attention. The manager moved behind the counter and looked toward one of the senior tellers. Her name was Angela Morales, and she had worked at the bank for nearly 15 years. Angela, could you please prepare a full account verification report for Ethan Carter? Angela blinked slightly, surprised by the formality of the request. Of course, she replied. She turned toward her computer and began entering the account number that Richard Collins provided. A few customers who had remained in line earlier were still standing nearby. Their expressions had shifted from casual curiosity to quiet interest. Ethan stood beside the counter patiently while Angela printed the report. The machine hummed softly as several pages slid out onto the tray. She gathered the documents carefully and handed them to Richard Collins. The manager reviewed the pages for a moment, making sure every figure matched the digital records. Then he turned toward Ethan again. Your account is secure exactly as your father arranged, he said calmly. The trust contains $3,482,910.44. A few customers standing nearby exchanged surprised glances when they heard the amount spoken aloud. The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment. Ethan nodded slowly, as if confirming something important rather than reacting to the size of the number. "That is good," he said quietly. "My father wanted me to check it." Richard Collins felt another small wave of respect pass through him. The boy was not impressed by the money itself. He only cared that the promise his father had made was still protected. The manager placed the printed documents into a clean folder and slid it gently across the counter. "This report explains everything about the trust account," he said. "When you're older, the account will transfer directly to your control for college and living expenses, exactly the way your father planned." Ethan picked up the folder carefully, holding it with the same attention he had given the bank book. "Thank you, sir." Angela Morales watched the exchange quietly. She had worked in banking long enough to recognize when something meaningful was happening. The room felt different now. The same boy who had walked into the bank earlier with worn shoes and quiet manners was now being treated with the same respect the bank normally reserved for its wealthiest clients. Richard Collins stepped around the counter again and faced Ethan directly. "Before you leave today, there is something I would like to say in front of everyone here." The customers nearby grew even quieter. The manager rested his hands lightly in front of him and spoke with calm sincerity. "Your father was a man who saved lives. One of those lives was mine." Ethan looked up at him with quiet surprise. Richard Collins continued speaking slowly so that everyone in the lobby could hear. 10 years ago, during a fire in a downtown office tower, your father carried people out of that building through heavy smoke and falling debris. I was one of the people he helped reach safety." The silence inside the bank deepened. Several customers lowered their eyes slightly as the meaning of the moment settled in. Richard Collins looked down at the boy's worn sneakers once more and then back at his face. "The man who built that trust account did not just protect your future. He protected many lives, including mine. And today, it is my honor to protect the future he built for you." The words spoken by Richard Collins seemed to settle slowly across the marble floor of the bank lobby. No one moved for several seconds. The customers who had been standing nearby were no longer watching with casual curiosity. Their expressions had changed into something quieter and more thoughtful. Ethan Carter stood still beside the counter, holding the folder and the worn bank book, his small hands gripping the edges carefully. He looked up at the manager again, as if trying to understand the full meaning of what had just been said. "My father saved your life?" Ethan asked softly. Richard Collins nodded once, his voice calm but steady. "Yes, he did. That night the smoke inside the building was so thick that it was difficult to see even a few feet ahead. Many people were trying to escape, but the stairwells were filled with heat and smoke. Your father kept going back inside again and again until everyone was out." Ethan listened quietly. The boy lowered his eyes for a moment, and a small, thoughtful expression appeared on his face. "My father always said the people in the fire were more scared than he was," Ethan said gently. Richard Collins felt his chest tighten slightly at the simple honesty of the statement. "That sounds exactly like him," he replied. Angela Morales, who had been standing behind the counter, stepped forward slowly. She looked at Ethan with a mixture of surprise and respect. "Your father must have been a remarkable man," she said quietly. Ethan nodded. "He worked very hard," he answered. "Sometimes he came home very late after a fire. But he always said that helping people was worth it." Several customers nearby shifted slightly as they listened. One older woman, standing in line, placed a hand gently over her heart. The bank lobby had become unusually quiet, as if everyone had suddenly remembered something important about the world outside money and numbers. Richard Collins looked down at the boy again. "Ethan, your father once carried 2 people out of that burning building while the smoke alarms were still screaming. One of those people was me. If he had not reached the stairwell when he did, I might not be standing here today." Ethan looked up again, his eyes steady. "Then I'm glad he found you," he said simply. The words were spoken with such calm sincerity that several people in the room exchanged small glances. Richard Collins felt a quiet warmth spread through his chest. Only minutes earlier, he had nearly dismissed the boy because of worn sneakers and a faded hoodie. Now he understood that the child standing in front of him carried the legacy of a man whose courage had changed many lives. The manager turned slightly toward the people standing in the lobby. I want everyone here to understand something, he said. The young man standing here today is the son of a firefighter who risked his life to protect strangers. Every dollar in that trust account represents years of sacrifice and planning so that his son would have opportunities in life. The customers listened carefully. The earlier tension in the room had transformed into quiet respect. Angela Morales looked down at Ethan again. Your father would be very proud of you for coming here today and making sure everything was safe, she said kindly. Ethan nodded slowly. He told me that if something ever happened to him, I should come here and make sure the account was still protected. Richard Collins looked at the boy again with a thoughtful expression. And you did exactly that, Ethan. The manager extended his hand gently. Thank you for trusting this bank to keep the promise your father built for you. Ethan looked at the hand for a moment and then shook it politely. His small fingers wrapped around the manager's hand with quiet confidence. Around them, the bank lobby remained silent for another moment, as if the entire room understood that something important had just happened. The boy who had entered the bank with worn-out shoes had walked in quietly and asked a simple question. But the story behind that question had reminded everyone in the room that true wealth is not measured only in money, but in the courage and sacrifice of the people who build a better future for those they love. The silence inside the bank lobby lingered for a moment after Ethan released Richard Collins' hand. The manager slowly lowered his hand and looked around the room. The expressions on the faces of the customers had changed. A few people nodded quietly as if they had just witnessed something important that went beyond ordinary banking business. Richard Collins took a slow breath and then turned his attention back to Ethan. Son, there is something else I would like to do today, he said gently. Ethan looked up with calm curiosity. What is that, sir? Richard Collins walked back behind the counter and picked up the printed account verification folder once more. He opened it carefully and reviewed the final pages again. Your father designed this trust account so that your future would be protected step by step. The account cannot be accessed directly until you are older, but there are certain protections and benefits that can begin now. Ethan listened quietly. The manager continued speaking in a thoughtful tone. For example, the trust allows limited educational support while you are still in school. That means books, tutoring, and certain school programs can be funded through the account if they help prepare you for college. Ethan nodded slowly as he absorbed the information. My father always said school was important, he replied. Richard Collins smiled slightly. Your father was absolutely right. The manager turned toward Angela Morales again. Angela, please contact the financial planning department and begin preparing a youth education support file for Ethan Carter. Angela nodded immediately. I will start that right away. The customers nearby watched the exchange with quiet interest. What had started as a simple account inquiry had now become something much more meaningful. Richard Collins stepped around the counter again and stood beside Ethan. He lowered his voice slightly, so the conversation felt more personal. Ethan, your father worked very hard to build this trust. But protecting money alone is not enough. The real purpose of the account is to make sure you have guidance and opportunities as you grow older. Ethan looked up at him. Guidance. Richard Collins nodded. Yes, that means people who help you understand how to use your education and your future wisely. The boy thought about the words for a moment. My father used to help me with my homework every night when he was home, Ethan said quietly. Sometimes he would fall asleep at the table because he had worked all day. Richard Collins felt a small knot form in his chest. Your father sounds like a man who cared deeply about your future. Ethan nodded again. He did. The manager looked toward the large windows of the bank for a moment before speaking again. Ethan, if you and your aunt are comfortable with the idea, I would like to personally make sure that your father's plan continues to work the way he intended. Ethan tilted his head slightly. What do you mean, sir? Richard Collins spoke slowly and clearly. I would like to act as an advisor for your trust account until you are old enough to manage it yourself. That means I will review the investments, monitor the account growth, and make sure every decision protects your future the same way your father planned. Ethan looked down at the folder in his hands and then back up at the manager. You would do that for me? Richard Collins nodded firmly. Your father once carried me out of a burning building when I could not walk down the stairs on my own. Helping protect your future is the least I can do to honor that courage. Ethan was quiet for a moment as he considered the offer. The bank lobby remained still around them. Finally, the boy spoke again in a calm voice. My father always said that good people look out for each other. Richard Collins felt a small smile return to his face. Your father was a very wise man. Ethan nodded slowly. Then I think you would like that idea. Around them, the quiet bank lobby seemed to breathe again as the moment settled. What had begun with laughter and doubt had transformed into something entirely different. The manager who had once underestimated the boy with worn shoes was now standing beside him with a promise to help protect the future his father had worked so hard to build. Richard Collins stood beside Ethan for a quiet moment after the boy agreed to his offer. The bank lobby slowly returned to its normal rhythm, but the atmosphere had clearly changed. Customers who had been watching earlier were now whispering softly to one another, their expressions thoughtful rather than curious. Angela Morales continued preparing documents at her computer, but every few seconds she glanced toward the boy and the manager with a small, respectful smile. Ethan still held the folder containing the trust information against his chest. The worn bank book rested on top of it like a small piece of history that had carried him into the building. Richard Collins finally spoke again in a calm voice. Ethan, there is one more thing I would like you to understand about your father. The boy looked up attentively. Yes, sir. Richard Collins folded his hands lightly in front of him as he spoke. When someone builds a trust like the one your father created, it means they were thinking many years into the future. They were not only planning for money. They were planning for the kind of person they hoped you would become. Ethan listened carefully, his eyes steady. My father used to say that the future is built one good decision at a time, he said softly. Richard Collins nodded slowly. That sounds exactly like the kind of wisdom that comes from someone who has seen difficult things and still chooses to help others. A few customers standing nearby had begun listening again, drawn back by the quiet sincerity of the conversation. One older man leaned gently against his cane and watched with calm interest. Richard Collins continued speaking. Ethan, the trust account your father created will help you attend college, choose a career, and build a stable life. But the real strength of that gift is the example he left behind. Ethan looked down for a moment and then back up. My aunt says the same thing, he replied. She says my father wanted me to become a man who helps people the way he did. Richard Collins felt a small warmth spread through his chest. Then your aunt understands him very well. Angela Morales finished organizing the printed documents and walked over to the counter with a new folder. She handed it to Richard Collins. Everything is prepared, she said quietly. The educational support file has been started and the trust advisory note has been added to the account. Richard Collins thanked her with a nod and handed the folder to Ethan. This contains the first steps of the plan we discussed. When you and your aunt review it together, you will see how the account can support your education as you grow older. Ethan accepted the folder carefully. Thank you, sir. Richard Collins then looked around the lobby again before speaking once more, his voice calm but clear enough for those nearby to hear. When Ethan walked into this bank today, some of us may have judged him too quickly. We saw worn shoes and assumed we understood his story. The customers standing nearby shifted slightly, listening with quiet attention. Richard Collins continued, but the truth is that this young man carries the legacy of a father whose courage saved lives. The respect in a room grew even deeper. The older man with the cane nodded slowly, as if he agreed completely. Ethan looked a little surprised by the attention, but remained calm. Richard Collins then lowered his voice again and spoke directly to the boy. Ethan, I want you to remember something as you grow older. Wealth can open doors in life, but character determines what happens after those doors open. Ethan thought about the sentence for a moment and then nodded. My father used to say something similar. He said that bravery means doing the right thing even when nobody is watching. Richard Collins smiled quietly. Your father was absolutely right. The The sunlight through the tall windows had shifted slightly across the marble floor as the afternoon continued. The bank lobby felt calmer now, almost peaceful. Richard Collins looked down once more at the boy with worn-out shoes and realized that the lesson of the day had not only been about a trust account. It had been about recognizing the quiet strength that sometimes walks through the door without being noticed. The quiet calm inside the bank continued as the afternoon sunlight stretched across the marble floor. The moment Richard Collins finished speaking, the room seemed to hold a thoughtful silence that lingered longer than any ordinary conversation inside a financial institution. Ethan Carter stood near the counter holding the folders that explained the future his father had built for him. The worn sneakers on his feet rested lightly against the polished floor, but now no one in the room was looking at those shoes with the same judgment as before. Angela Morales leaned slightly against the counter and watched the boy with a gentle expression. In all her years working in banking, she had seen large balances and important clients come and go, but the story behind this account felt different. It reminded everyone present that the numbers inside the computer system represented something deeper than money. Richard Collins glanced once more at the trust documents before speaking again in a softer tone meant only for Ethan. Your father planned for many years to make sure you would always have opportunities in life. But the most important part of that plan is the person you choose to become as you grow older. Ethan listened carefully. The boy lowered his eyes briefly as if remembering something important. My father told me something the night before he went back to work after his last long recovery. Ethan said quietly. Richard Collins waited patiently. What did he say? Ethan spoke slowly as he remembered the words. He said that courage is not only running into a burning building. Courage is also living a life that helps people even when things are difficult. Richard Collins felt the sentence settle into the room like a quiet echo of Marcus Carter himself. That is a very powerful lesson, he said gently. Ethan nodded. My father believed that the future is built by helping the people around you. A few customers still standing nearby listened with thoughtful attention. The older man with the cane gave a slow nod as if he recognized the truth in those words. Richard Collins looked down at the boy and felt something close to gratitude rise in his chest. Ethan, your father already did something extraordinary when he saved lives during that fire. But the trust he built for you shows that he was also thinking about the life you would live long after he was gone. Ethan held the folder a little closer. I want to make him proud, he said simply. Richard Collins placed one hand lightly on the counter beside him. The best way to honor your father is to live with the same character he showed every day. Angela Morales stepped forward again and placed a small envelope beside the folder Ethan was holding. Inside this envelope is a copy of the trust contact information and my direct office number, she explained kindly. If you or your aunt ever have questions about the account or the education support program, you can call us anytime. Ethan accepted the envelope politely. Thank you very much. Richard Collins then looked around the bank lobby once more. The expressions of the people standing there had changed completely from the moment Ethan first walked through the doors. Earlier the room had seen a quiet boy with worn shoes and assumed his story ended there. Now they understood that the same boy carried the legacy of a father whose courage had touched many lives. Richard Collins turned back to Ethan with a calm, respectful smile. You came here today to make sure your father promise was still protected. I want you to know that it is not only protected. It will continue growing just as he planned. Ethan nodded once more. That is all I wanted to know. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The afternoon light moved slowly across the room while the steady rhythm of the bank resumed around them. But everyone present understood that something meaningful had happened during those quiet minutes. The story of a firefighter named Marcus Carter had traveled into that bank through the footsteps of his son and reminded every person in the room that true legacy is built through sacrifice, courage, and love for the people who come after us. For a few quiet seconds after the conversation ended, no one in the bank lobby moved. The afternoon light stretched across the marble floor while the gentle hum of machines slowly returned to the room. Ethan Carter stood calmly beside the counter, holding the folder and the envelope that now carried the future his father had carefully built for him. The worn sneakers on. His feet rested softly against the polished floor, but the room no longer saw those shoes the same way. Richard Collins watched the boy with thoughtful eyes. Only a short time earlier he had laughed quietly, assuming the child in front of him did not belong in a place like this. Now he understood that the boy standing there carried a legacy far greater than the numbers inside a bank account. Ethan finally looked up again. "Thank you for helping me today," he said politely. Richard Collins nodded slowly. "It was an honor, Ethan." The boy turned slightly toward the glass entrance doors of the bank. The afternoon sun outside glowed warmly against the sidewalk and passing cars. For a moment, he stood quietly, as if thinking about the long bus ride he would take home and the conversation he would soon have with his aunt. Richard Collins stepped forward one last time. "Ethan, before you go, I want you to remember something." Ethan looked back at him. "Yes, sir." Richard Collins spoke calmly, but with deep sincerity. "The money your father saved will open doors for you one day. But the greatest gift he gave you is the example he left behind. Courage, responsibility, and the desire to help others." Ethan nodded slowly, as if he already understood. "My father used to say something like that too," he replied. "He said that a man is measured by the people he helps, not by the things he owns." Richard Collins felt a quiet smile return to his face. "Your father was a wise man." Angela Morales stepped forward from behind the counter and gave Ethan a small, respectful nod. "Your father would be very proud of you today," she said kindly. Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment before answering softly. "I hope so." The older man with the cane, who had been watching the entire scene, lifted his hat slightly toward the boy in a quiet gesture of respect. A few other customers nodded as well. The room no longer saw a boy with worn shoes. They saw the son of a man whose courage had saved lives and whose sacrifice had quietly built a future for his child. Ethan walked toward the glass doors and pushed them open. The bright afternoon air rushed gently into the bank lobby as he stepped outside. Richard Collins stood near the counter, watching him walk down the sidewalk toward the bus stop at the corner. The boy moved with the same calm patience he had shown from the moment he entered the bank. Richard Collins remained there for several seconds after the doors closed again. The numbers on the computer screens around him suddenly felt less important than the lesson he had just witnessed. A boy had walked into the bank wearing worn-out shoes and asking a simple question about an account balance. But the truth behind that question had revealed something much greater. Marcus Carter had not only saved lives during a fire many years earlier. He had also built a promise for his son with every sacrifice he made. Richard Collins quietly returned to his desk and looked once more at the account file. $3,482,910.44 remained safely protected inside the trust. But the real legacy of Marcus Carter was not the money he left behind. It was the character he had passed on to the boy who walked out of the bank with quiet confidence and a future full of possibilities.